Greetings, friends around the world. This is Dr. Bob Thiel, the Bible News Prophecy channel. We'd like to talk about GMO risks in the Bible. Now, what are GMOs? Well, GMOs are genetically modified organisms, and that's what the initials G, M, and O stand for. Basically, these are engineered items, typically foods, where the genetic code of some item, plant or animal, is put in or encoded into another one. And sometimes it's done in other ways. But basically what happens with a GMO is a substance is produced, a creation, a living thing generally, is produced that could not possibly be produced in nature. A lot of foods in the food supply now have GMOs. Some of the more common ones would be canola oil, corn actually, soy, and sugar beets. Those are all pretty common as far as in the United States containing GMOs or that are made up of GMOs. Also, a lot of synthetic vitamins contain GMOs, and a lot of things do have GMOs. Now, they've come up with some really weird things with these genetically modified organisms. In addition to the foods that I've mentioned, or the foods that have been tainted, they also have done things such as cross spider genes in with goats so they could come up with a goat basically that produces a type of milk that can be spun into making bulletproof vests and things like that. And actually they display a couple of those goats over in a museum in Canada now. In addition to that, they've tried to put human genes into cows to affect milk production. They put sponge genes into potatoes so the farmer will know when to water the crop based on the wilting of it. They've also talked about putting mouse genes in with cows, and there's all kinds of weird things that are going on with that. The problem with this is that this is dangerous. Now, some people say that only pseudoscientists believe this. Is really not a scientific view. Well, I'd like to read from a couple of sources. The first one is going to be from Harvard. It says, modified organisms can, in addition, escape from greenhouse and fields and aquaculture cages in nature and disrupt their biodiversity. So Harvard scientists are saying, look, there are environmental risks associated with that. Furthermore, it says GM foods, genetically modified organism foods, may also damage biodiversity, for example, by promoting greater use of certain pesticides associated with GM crops that are particularly toxic to many species, and by introducing exotic genes and organisms into the environment that may disrupt natural plant communities and other ecosystems. So that's from Harvard. What about the World Health Organization? Gene transfer from GMO foods to cells of the body or to bacteria in the intestinal tract would cause concern if it affects human health materially. We think this probability is low. They don't say it won't exist, but they just don't think it's a big deal. But the other thing they go into is the movement of genes from GMO plants into conventional crops or to related species in the wild, called outcrossing, as well as mixing crops, can have indirect effect on food safety and food security. This risk is real, as was shown when traces of maize type was only approved for feed use appeared in maize products for human consumption in U.S. America. So the World Health Organization says the risks associated with GMOs are real. And they're also concerned what's going to happen if this goes into the normal environment. In addition, we've got a situation now where we've got a reduction of honeybees. The Russians have told the United States, actually President Putin of Russia told the United States that they're extremely outraged with the fact that the United States actually passed what's been called the Monsanto Protection Act, which allows companies such as Monsanto, which produce these genetically modified foods, to basically be immune from most types of lawsuits. And the Russians are concerned that this is affecting bees. There's so much concern with bees right now that the European Union's actually outlawed the use of a certain type of herbicide for 3 years to see if it will help or not. Now, there's a company in Switzerland called Syngenta who produces one of these pesticides, and they say, well, this whole bee thing is complicated. You know, we ought to look into this. Don't, you know, go out and make our herbicides illegal, or don't do stuff like that. It's probably not us. But they don't know. Now, one of the problems with GMOs is they go against creation. How do they go against creation? Well, if you take your Bibles and go to the book of Genesis, chapter 1, we'll start in verse 11. It said, then God said, let the earth bring forth the grass, the herb that yields seeds, and the fruit tree and yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth, and it was so. Verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass, and the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God said that that was good. So we see that God said it was good that plants have seeds, and these seeds reproduce after the same kind. In other words, you put a tomato seed in the ground, you get another tomato. That type of a thing. And furthermore, if you go down to Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, it says, and God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So God said, look, I made everything so it would reproduce with its own kind, toward its own kind. And that was good. But GMOs don't do that. They go against those particular laws of nature. Now, interestingly, one of the supposed benefits of GMOs is that they're going to be resistant to certain types of pesticides. And there's actually a corn product that's being affected by a voracious bug that hits the roots, and this is a GMO corn. And this was supposedly not supposed to happen, but it does. In addition, the use of some of these pesticides and GMO products have been leading to the growing of what's called super weeds. These are weeds that don't respond to other pesticides, or herbicides. And in addition to that, as I mentioned before, we're getting like super worms because of the use of some of these crops. And there are problems, for example, in the cornfields in Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and Nebraska that were overran by rootworm in 2011. This rootworm wasn't supposed to be a problem for that. Now, most developed nations do not consider GMOs to be safe. In fact, more than 60 countries around the world, including Australia, Japan, and all the countries of the EU, there are significant restrictions or outright bans on the use of them. In the U.S., however, GMOs are in as much as 80% of the conventionally processed food. So we've got a problem that in the United States we use a whole lot of it. Now, some studies have suggested, like for example, there's a rat study that suggested that this GMO corn can produce tumors, it can produce organ damage. Others have said that report shouldn't really count. But there are other types of things. In Argentina, Dr. Andres Carasaco was supposed to speak on a study talking about one of these herbicides that related to these in birth defects. He wasn't allowed to speak. We've got the issue that genetically modified foods are not totally safe, and it's because we don't know everything there is to know about food. In addition to that, Harvard says the decrease in the lutein levels in rice, for example, this is from a genetically modified rice, was associated with an unintended increase in the levels of compounds called prolamines, which can affect the nutritional quality of rice and increase its potential to induce an allergic reaction or allergic response. That's from Genetically Modified Foods from the Presidents and Fellows of Harvard College. So Harvard is saying, look, the food gets affected, it changes the chemicals inside. This can cause allergies. Some believe it causes other issues. I believe what it does, however, is it basically means that we could have massive loss of crops in the United States. You're going into what's called monoculture, which is something the United States already tends to do. If you go through like the Midwest, you'll see just all fields just of corn or fields just of wheat or something like that. But with genetically modified foods, not only is it just one item, it's genetically just one item. So the whole crop is more susceptible to the same predator, whether it's a fungus or a root worm or some kind of bacteria or something else. They're basically putting the United States in a position where it is at great risk. Now, other countries are at risk as well, but the United States itself is probably at the greatest single risk because it seems to produce the most GMO crops of anybody in the world. Now, in May of 2013, there was actually demonstrations around the world. At least 100,000 people demonstrated against Monsanto, and considering that this is pretty risky to be putting these crops out. Monsanto, as I mentioned earlier, got special legal protection for the United States, so it can't get sued for certain problems that its genetically modified foods may cause. But others are starting to wonder about that and wonder if there's actually risks associated with it. Now, it was found recently that in Oregon, genetically modified wheat was growing. Now, supposedly, there is no genetically modified wheat. There isn't supposed to be any in the food supply. And I know there's a debate about some change that happened with wheat years ago. We'll ignore that for the time being. But the type of, let's say, Monsanto type genetically modified wheat is not in the general food supply. Well, they found some in Oregon. And they said this was unexpected. Right, and that's the problem with GMOs. The scientists act like they know everything there is to know about food, but they don't know everything about food. They don't know everything about nutrition. They don't know everything about how the ecology is going to be affected. What they do know is the economy. Basically, GMOs are out there to make more money, presumably, for the farmer and the chemical companies. And you say, well, doesn't it make more food and aren't people starving? Yes, there are people starving. I don't believe the rate of starvation has dropped since the introduction of GMO foods, or so it's imperceptible and it's not related to the production of GMO foods. But the reality is, it's greed and economics that fuel the GMO explosion. And I call it a GMO explosion because there were no GMO foods in the food supply until the flavor saver tomato, as they called it, was introduced in 1994. It only lasted until about 1997, and it's no longer in the food supply. Well, the company that made it was Calgen, got taken over by Monsanto. So while we don't have genetically modified tomatoes in the food supply, as far as I know right now, what we do have are, as I said, mentioned corn, soy, sugar beets, and zucchini too. A lot of that is also genetically modified. Now, I mentioned that there was a situation about genetically modified wheat being unexpectedly found in Oregon. Well, after it was unexpectedly found, over in Japan and in Korea, South Korea, they put a moratorium or temporary suspension on importing American wheat because they were told that was not supposed to happen. And one of the Korean scientists told the European Union, you guys should do the same kind of a thing. And I will read again. This is about of the Oregon situation. They grew winter wheat in 2012. It says when the farmers sprayed the so-called volunteer plant with a glyphosate herbicide, which would probably be Roundup, some of them unexpectedly survived. Samples were sent to Oregon State University and the USDA for analysis. Okay, the reality is this shows that you can't control nature the way some of these big companies think you can. We don't know everything there is to know about food. So the United States is being affected. Now here's an interesting headline related to the whole GMO thing. It says, Monsanto is a ticking time bomb for U.S. agriculture. And that's true. If something happens with GMOs that gets more widespread understanding, or there's a big outbreak of something, and this causes problems with human health that is more generally seen, nations who import food from the United States may be very, very hesitant. And again, because of the fact that there wasn't supposed to be any GMO wheat, and now that there is, has gotten some people to wonder, how safe is the U.S. food supply, and how reliable is the United States as a supplier when this type of thing is not supposed to happen. And back in 2010, I wrote, I suspect that one of the biggest pestilences will hit the U.S. and Canada will be when some pathogens attack one or more of their genetically modified crops and results in some type of famine within North America. Now, the time is coming when we're going to see food shortages and famines. Now, I'm going to read from another source. This is from Dr. Rima Truth Reports, and she's an MD. From her report, it says, GMO crop failures are growing. In 2009, a South African corn crop failure was linked to GMO seeds. And the USDA did nothing. And here's her reason why. The biotech system that provides through user fees most of the FDA and USDA budget can never be questioned. Could it be, though, that GMO cloned monoculture itself is to blame? Are these chimeric species failing when they face stress conditions? GMOs literally invade natural species and infect them with alien DNA. We need to rid the planet of these dangerous species that could result in famine if not checked. Well, the Bible does talk about famines, and it warns about them for disobedience. For example, let me read Deuteronomy 28. starting in verse 47. So this is Deuteronomy 48. Because you did not serve the Lord your God with gladness of heart for the abundance of everything, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, in needs of everything. He'll put a yoke of iron in your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord will bring against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as eagles fly, a nation's language you do not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which does not respect the elderly nor favor the young. And they shall eat the increase of your livestock and produce of your land, so you're destroyed. They shall not leave you grain or wine or oil or the increase of your cattle or your offspring or your flocks until they've destroyed you. So we've got the Bible warning because of disobedience, there's going to be hunger. Let me read Lamentations chapter 2, verse 19. Arise, cry out in the night. At the beginning of the watches, pour out your heart like water before the face of the Lord. Lift your hands toward him for the life of your children, who faint from hunger at the end of every street. And there's a lot more prophecies in the Bible related to famines coming. One that Jesus says, we'll go to the book of Matthew chapter 24. We'll cut this in the middle of verse 7. Jesus said, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Could a massive loss of crops due to our reliance on genetically modified organisms be a factor for this type of famine? And the ultimate destruction of the U.S. and its Anglo allies? That's a very real possibility. Now, some have gone out and said that, there's no difference between GMO food and non-GMO food. Matter of fact, one report I read says they're nutritionally identical. Oh, really? Nutritionally identical. Well, if you're trying to say, well, it's got the same amount of calories, perhaps the same amount of water and some things like that, yeah, they're possibly identical. But as far as to be nutritionally identical, I think that means they also have to be chemically identical. And the reality is that foods that are genetically modified are not chemically identical. Why? For example, most of the things that Monsanto makes in terms of genetically modified so-called foods are to be resistant to its herbicide, its trademark herbicide called Roundup. Well, the plant therefore has changed. It is not the same chemical, or at least biologically and most likely and chemically, it's not the same. Therefore, to say it's nutritionally identical is not the case. That is a deception. And the Bible warned about deception increasing at the time of the end. If you take your Bible and go to 2 Timothy chapter 3, we're going to read verse 13. That's 2 Timothy 3, verse 13. But evil men and impostors will grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. So sadly, many who defend GMOs are deceived, or they don't properly represent true science, or as says in 1 Timothy 6:20, what is falsely called knowledge. So some go out and say, the scientific community, we all think this is all fine. But that's simply not the case. Scientists who've looked at this realize that there are ecological risks with GMOs. There are human health risks with GMOs, and there's a massive crop failure risk with GMOs that may be a factor in the complete elimination of the United States. GMOs appear to violate God's law. They cannot possibly reproduce after their own kind. Christians should be cautious about GMOs and try to avoid them. These are not foods that God intended for you to eat. Disaster is going to come to the United States and its Anglo allies, and I suspect that GMO foods will be part of it. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel.